Late at night, in the heart of Easton's most dangerous neighborhood, Officer Tom Reed stood watch, eyes scanning the dimly lit streets, his gaze locked on a sleek black sedan rolling through the area, far too fancy for the rough surroundings. The car slowed, and instinct told him something was off. He flicked on his siren, his lights cutting through the darkness as the car pulled over. Officer Reed approached, his boots echoing in the silence. The driver's side window rolled down, revealing Dr. Maria King, an impeccably dressed black woman with an air of quiet authority. Her sharp suit and poised demeanor were a stark contrast to the gritty environment, and Reed couldn't help but feel an unsettling sense of superiority. "Good evening, ma'am. Do you know why I stopped you?" Tom asked. His voice cool and commanding, Maria met his gaze with a calmness that made him uneasy. "I'm not sure, officer," she replied evenly, her tone smooth. Reed looked at her luxury car and assumed she didn't belong here. It was too nice and she was too confident. He demanded she step out and allow a search of her vehicle. Maria hesitated, but when she questioned the request, Reed's patience snapped. "You don't have a choice," he barked, his face tightening with rage. Maria, undeterred, stood her ground. "I'm not going to let you search my car without a reason." Frustration boiled over in Reed. Without warning, he slapped her across the face, expecting her to break, to cower under his force. But she didn't, not even a flicker of fear. Instead, Maria stood still, her expression unshaken, her eyes locking with his. Her defiance was almost too much for Reed to handle, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a cold shiver of doubt. Who was she? As the slap echoed in the stillness of the night, Officer Tom Reed stood frozen for a moment, expecting Maria to crumble, to beg for mercy, to show weakness. But she didn't. Her cheek glowed red where his hand had struck, but her face remained stoic, her gaze unwavering. Not a tremor in her hands, not a flinch in her body. Tom's heart skipped a beat, an uncomfortable realization creeping up his spine. But his pride quickly smothered the flicker of doubt. He was the law. He controlled the streets. He had her in his grasp, and he wasn't about to let some woman, especially a woman who dared to challenge him, get the better of him. "Resisting arrest," he growled, his voice harsh with authority as he grabbed her arms roughly, slapping cold metal cuffs on her wrists. Maria said nothing, just stood there, her posture still impeccable, her expression unreadable. The crowd, once murmuring, now grew louder. Phones came out of pockets, cameras flashing, capturing every moment, every second of the spectacle. The streets of Easton had become their stage, and the show was just beginning. Tom gritted his teeth as he shoved Maria toward his cruiser. His hand was too tight on her arm, pulling her forward with more force than necessary. He wanted to see her break, to show that he was in control. He wanted to break her will just as easily as he had slapped her. But Maria didn't flinch. Not once. She didn't even blink. The crowd was growing. He could feel the eyes of dozens of people on him now, the weight of their judgment pressing down on his shoulders. He didn't care. This was his town, his beat. He could do whatever he wanted. He had done it before. He would do it again. As he pushed her toward the back seat of his cruiser, the murmurs from the crowd turned to shouts. "What did she do? She's done nothing," one man yelled, his voice rising above the others. A woman shouted, "You can't do this. She hasn't done anything wrong." But Tom ignored them, shoving Maria into the back seat with a force that made her slide across the seat. the door slamming shut behind her with a finality that echoed through the street. He slammed his hand against the roof of the car, signaling to himself that the job was done. His chest heaved, but he pushed the discomfort down. He would be fine. He always was. Tom climbed into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut. The engine roared to life, tires screeching as he sped away, the crowd's voices fading behind him. But something was different now. Something felt off. His palms were slick on the wheel, his breath shallow. The adrenaline was wearing off, and what had started as a show of power was quickly becoming a strange, gnawing feeling of uncertainty. Maria was still in the back, sitting perfectly still, her hands cuffed, her eyes straight ahead, not even acknowledging the cuffs or the way her face still burned from his slap. She hadn't spoken a word since that moment, not even after being tossed into the car like a criminal. It wasn't fear that radiated from her, but something colder, something deeper. Tom couldn't place it, that he glanced at her in the rearview mirror. Her eyes met his in the reflection, unblinking, unwavering. There was no fear in them, no anger, no defiance. There was only something else. Something that unsettled him in a way he couldn't understand. "Why aren't you crying?" Tom muttered under his breath. His words were low, barely audible above the sound of the engine. Maria didn't answer. Of course, she didn't. He tried to shake the discomfort off, focusing back on the road. The streetlights flickered past as he drove, each one casting a brief, sharp shadow across the car. A brief moment of clarity hit him. This was just another night, another arrest, another person who'd try to resist and then comply. That's how it always went. They fought, they resisted, and eventually they broke. But not her. Not Maria King. Tom's grip tightened on the wheel. He tried to laugh it off, but the sound was hollow, dead in his throat. He couldn't shake the feeling that he'd made a mistake, that somehow he'd crossed a line he hadn't meant to cross. But it was too late now. He couldn't turn back. Not with her in the back seat. Not with the entire city's eyes on him. The police precinct came into view, the brick building looming in the distance like a fortress. Tom pulled into the parking lot, tires grinding over the cracked asphalt. The precinct was quiet, but as he opened the door and stepped out, the eerie silence hung in the air, thick and heavy. There was a stillness about the place tonight, something that unsettled him further. He opened the back door to pull Maria out, his hand tightening on her elbow. But this time, when he touched her, she didn't resist. She just stood, her body rigid, moving like a statue, the cuffs biting into her skin. Her expression was as calm as it had been all night. As he dragged her through the door of the precinct, the atmosphere shifted. The officers at their desks, typing away or answering phones, fell silent. Their eyes all turned toward them, the room going still as if time had stopped. Tom's chest tightened. Something was wrong. "What's going on?" Tom muttered under his breath. He didn't understand why the whole room had gone quiet. He'd arrested countless people. This was nothing new. But tonight, it felt different. Then, as Tom tried to shove Maria forward, a rookie cop, his face pale, dropped his clipboard. "Holy shit!" he whispered, eyes wide with recognition. Tom frowned. "What? That's Dr. Maria King," the rookie said, his voice cracking. "The chief of police." The words hit Tom like a punch to the gut. He froze, his body locked in place, his mind struggling to process the information. Dr. Maria King, the chief of police. He'd just slapped the most powerful woman in the city. And the realization, too late, sank in like a weight, crushing everything else around him. The room fell completely silent as all eyes turned on him. Tom's knees felt weak, the floor beneath him beginning to spin. The shame, the fear, the realization, it was all crashing down at once. But it was too late now. Maria's stillness, her silence, was louder than any of the shouts from the crowd. It was a silence that was about to undo everything Tom had ever known. Tom Reed's heart hammered in his chest, his body frozen at the rookie officer's words. The words echoed in his ears, bouncing off the walls of the precinct like a relentless drumbeat. The chief of police. He'd slapped her. He had slapped the most powerful woman in Easton. The woman whose name commanded respect, whose decisions shaped the very foundation of the city's justice system. A chill spread through his body, creeping up his spine and curling around his limbs, paralyzing him in the moment. He had arrested countless people in his career, humiliated them, put them in cuffs, but this was different. This wasn't just another petty criminal. This wasn't someone he could walk all over. Maria King. He had never connected the dots, never thought to question who she was. She didn't look like the chief of police to him, not with her calm demeanor, not with the way she had stood her ground in the face of his brutality. Tom stood in the middle of the precinct, the weight of his mistake crashing down on him with brutal clarity. His eyes darted from the rookie officer to the other cops in the room. They were all staring at him now, their eyes wide, their faces filled with shock and disbelief. Some exchanged glances, others shook their heads, and all of them, every single one, were looking at him like he was a criminal. He had crossed a line, and now they were waiting to see how he would react. But Tom wasn't ready to give in. His chest tightened, his breath shallow. He couldn't show weakness. He couldn't let them see that he was rattled, that his confidence had shattered into 1,000 pieces. He had been the law for so long, had been untouchable, and he wasn't going to let a woman, especially not a black woman, destroy that. Get a grip, Reed, he muttered under his breath, his voice rough but firm. He straightened his back, his posture rigid, his mind racing as he tried to regain control. He had made a mistake, yes, but that didn't mean he was finished. Not yet. He looked down at Maria, still standing there in silence, her wrists cuffed, her gaze unblinking. The crowd outside had been replaced by the silence inside the precinct, but Maria's presence was just as overwhelming as the mob that had once surrounded her. She didn't need to say a word. Her stillness, her poise, her very being was more powerful than any speech, and it made Tom uneasy. He wasn't used to feeling small, not in his own precinct, not in his own city. But the rookie officer's words kept ringing in his ears. The chief of police. Tom gritted his teeth, forcing himself to act. He motioned toward the desk sergeant. Get her processed, he snapped, trying to push the uncomfortable weight of the situation out of his mind. Resisting arrest, disorderly conduct, the usual charges. The sergeant hesitated, his hand hovering over the keyboard, clearly unsure how to proceed. Tom's eyes narrowed, and his pulse quickened. He couldn't back down. Not here, not now, not in front of his officers. Maria still hadn't spoken, but Tom could feel her gaze burning into him. He didn't dare meet her eyes. He refused to show any sign of vulnerability. He turned to the rookie officer who had spoken. What did you say her name was again? The rookie stammered, unsure whether to speak further. Dr. Maria King. She's the chief of police, sir. Tom's heart thudded painfully in his chest as the words sank in. He tried to remain composed, to maintain the illusion of control, but it was slipping piece by piece. Maria King. The name now carried so much weight, so much power. His arrogance, the sense of invincibility he had felt moments ago, was dissolving into thin air. But still, he refused to back down. The officers in the room, who had once looked up to him, now seemed to shrink back. Their eyes darted nervously, and some even took a step back, sensing that something had shifted. The air felt thick with uncertainty. They were all watching him now, waiting for him to make his next move, to either hold his ground or crumble under the weight of his actions. Tom clenched his fists. He could feel the eyes on him, the whispers beginning to stir. He couldn't let this moment define him. He had been through worse. He had faced down riots, drug lords, even gang violence. But this was different. This was a woman, a black woman, and she had just exposed the limits of his power. The reality of his situation hit him harder than any fight he had ever been in. This wasn't about winning. This was about survival. With a forced breath, Tom took a step forward, his voice colder than before. "I don't care who she is. I'm doing my job." She resisted. She assaulted an officer. She's not above the law. But as the words left his mouth, a part of him knew they were hollow. His mind raced as he tried to convince himself that he was still in control. He was the law. He had to believe that. He couldn't let go of the belief that his badge was everything, that it gave him power, that it made him untouchable. But as the rookie officer's face filled with dread, and the other cops began to exchange nervous glances, Tom knew deep down that this was the beginning of the end. Maria's quiet strength had already unraveled him, and it was only a matter of time before everyone else saw it too. The next morning, Easton was in turmoil. The air felt heavy, charged with an electric energy that wasn't there the day before. The streets, usually quiet and ignored by those in power, were now alive with voices, opinions, and an unrelenting storm of disbelief. The video of Tom Reed slapping Maria King had gone viral, spreading like wildfire through social media, news stations, and cell phones. It was everywhere. People watched in shock as an officer, one of their own, struck the chief of police, a woman whose position commanded not just authority, but respect. The footage showed everything: the slap, the crowd's reaction, the sound that lingered in the air long after the impact. It was a sharp, cold reminder of the fragile line between power and vulnerability, and it struck a chord in the hearts of people all over the city. And for the first time in a long while, it wasn't just the streets of Easton that were buzzing with anger. It was the entire nation. Protests erupted in every corner of the city. The chants were loud, desperate. Justice for Maria. No more abuse of power. People marched, signs held high, demanding accountability not just for the slap, but for the years of corruption, for the systems that allowed this to happen time and time again. Inside the precinct, things were spiraling out of control for Tom Reed. His once untouchable position as a pillar of the department was crumbling piece by piece. Officers who had once backed him, laughed with him, and followed his lead were now avoiding eye contact. The whispers had started, and they weren't in his favor. There were no more nods of approval, no more mutual understanding that he had always had in the past. Now, all he saw were glances filled with pity, fear, and disdain. It was as if everyone had suddenly realized what he was capable of, and, more importantly, what he had been hiding. Internal Affairs opened an investigation into his past actions, and the floodgates opened wide. Cases from his past, cases that had been buried, swept under the rug, were now being pulled into the light. Officers he had once silenced were coming forward. Victims he had ignored or worse, manipulated, were speaking up. The whispers of corruption that had always been just below the surface were now taking form, giving names, faces, and stories. People who had been crushed under the weight of his badge were rising, and their voices were finally being heard. Tom tried to bury the panic rising in his chest. He could still hold his ground. He could still argue, could still twist the truth, bend the narrative in his favor. But the more he tried, the more the walls closed in on him. Maria's actions, her quiet but firm stand, had awakened something in the city, something he couldn't fight. The public wasn't listening to his version of events anymore. They had seen the video. They had seen the truth. The pressure was mounting, and it felt like a storm that he couldn't outrun. The whispers in the precinct grew louder, and the accusations, each one sharper than the last, cut through him like 1,000 knives. No one, not even his most loyal allies, could shield him from the overwhelming force of the truth. And as the investigation into his actions deepened, as the flood of damning evidence continued to roll in, Maria took her first steps toward action. She wasn't just going to let this go. She couldn't. She had already weathered the storm of his violence, of his arrogance. But now, She was going to make sure that no one else had to suffer the same fate. Maria was a woman of resolve, and this wasn't just about her pride or her career, it was about justice. It was about standing up for those who had been silenced by men like Tom. Maria's quiet determination was beginning to shake the very foundations of the system Tom had once believed he controlled. She wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. Her voice rang out in every press conference, every public statement, every piece of communication from the police department. She laid bare the truth of what had happened, what was still happening, and what needed to change. The city, once paralyzed by fear and apathy, was waking up. They were looking to her now for leadership, for hope. And Maria gave it to them in the only way she knew how, by leading with integrity, by being the change that the people of Easton so desperately needed. But Tom Reed was unraveling. His career was in free fall and there was no safety net to catch him. He had spent years using his badge to terrorize, to control, to manipulate. He had never thought there would be a day when he would have to pay the price for his actions. But that day had come, and it was going to cost him everything. The walls of the precinct, once a symbol of his power, now felt like a prison. His own officers were turning their backs on him. And outside, the streets of Easton were no longer his domain. They belonged to the people. The cries for justice had become louder than ever before, and Tom could feel the weight of their demands pressing down on him, suffocating him. He had made a grave mistake, and now the consequences were inevitable. The courtroom was a battlefield, and Maria King stood at the helm, unshaken, her resolve unyielding. Tom Reed sat across from her, his face pale, his eyes darting nervously between the lawyers and the judge. He had always prided himself on his ability to control the situation, to twist the narrative to his favor. But today he was the one in the hot seat. Today, the truth had a voice, and it was louder than anything he could shout over. Maria, calm as ever, walked to the stand, a folder of documents in her hand, and she laid it out. Every lie, every abuse, every act of corruption that Tom had committed. The evidence she presented was damning. The crowd in the courtroom grew still as they saw for themselves the extent of Tom's actions, the cruelty he had hidden beneath the badge he had worn for so long. His history of brutality wasn't just isolated incidents. It was a pattern, a deliberate use of his power to destroy lives. And Maria, the woman he had tried to break, was the one who would bring it all crashing down. She detailed the cases he had manipulated, the people he had framed, the countless lives he had shattered in his unrelenting pursuit of control. She showed photographs, disturbing images of the victims he had harmed, testimonies of those whose lives had been destroyed by his hands. The courtroom was silent, the weight of the evidence pressing down on everyone. There was no room for doubt, no escape for Tom. The walls were closing in on him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The prosecutor's voice cut through the tension like a sharp blade. Officer Reed, you've been convicted of numerous charges. Assault, framing, abuse of power, and, most significantly, hate crimes. You have terrorized this community for years, using your badge as a shield to protect your corruption. You've struck a woman who is the embodiment of justice, the very person who represents everything you've trampled on. You've hurt more people than we can count, and for that you will pay. Tom's stomach churned as the weight of those words hit him. The faces of the victims he had wronged, the ones whose lives he had ruined, flashed before his eyes. He thought he could get away with it. He thought his badge would protect him forever. But Maria had stripped him of that illusion. She had exposed him for what he truly was, a man driven by power, consumed by his own arrogance, willing to destroy anyone who stood in his way. The defense tried to spin it, tried to make it seem like Tom was a man under pressure, a man who had acted out of fear, but the evidence was undeniable. His actions spoke louder than any excuse he could come up with. His career as a police officer had been built on lies, violence, and intimidation. He had hurt so many people, and now the world was finally seeing him for who he really was. The jury deliberated for what seemed like an eternity, but it felt inevitable. The truth had been laid bare, and there was no way to hide from it. Tom's life was in ruins, his reputation in tatters. When the verdict finally came, it was not a surprise to anyone in the room. Guilty? the judge said, her voice firm. A final nail in the coffin of Tom's twisted career. The sentence was swift. Officer Tom Reed, you are hereby sentenced to 20 years in prison, with no possibility of parole. The words echoed in Tom's mind as he stood, numb, unable to move, unable to comprehend what had just happened. His knees buckled beneath him, and the reality of the situation slammed into him like a freight train. He had lost everything. His job, his freedom, his dignity. The very things he had once thought defined him were gone. Taken away by a woman he had underestimated. By a woman he had tried to destroy as the officers moved to take him away. Maria's eyes locked with his. There was no triumph in her gaze, no gloating. Just a quiet, unwavering strength that spoke volumes. She had done what needed to be done. Not for herself, but for the countless victims who had suffered at Tom's hands. And now, the scales of justice had been balanced. Tom was finally being held accountable for the destruction he had caused. The crowd outside the courtroom erupted in applause, chanting Maria's name. But inside, the silence was deafening. Tom was led out, his shoulders slumped, his head bowed. The man who had once walked with an air of invincibility was now a broken man, and Maria King had been the one to bring him down as the door slammed behind him. Maria turned to face the courtroom. She had won, but the fight wasn't over. The battle for justice, for equality, was ongoing. And today, she had taken one more step forward. The days bled into weeks, and weeks into months, but Tom Reed never got used to the life inside. The cold, sterile walls of the prison pressed in on him from all sides, a constant reminder that he was no longer in control. The man who once walked the streets of Easton with authority, his badge shining as a symbol of power, was now a shadow of himself. His name no longer commanded respect. It evoked disgust. Tom had hoped that, with time, the whispers of his past would fade. He had convinced himself that the other inmates would eventually forget the face of the man who had been the law. But he was wrong. Every glance, every sneer, every whispered comment reminded him of his fall from grace. The prisoners knew who he was. They knew what he had done, and they made sure to remind him of it every chance they got at first. The threats were subtle. A few insults shouted across the yard, a cold stare from across the cafeteria. But soon it escalated. The whispers turned into taunts. The taunts turned into threats. And the threats turned into violence. Tom tried to ignore them at first to keep his head down, but it was impossible. Every time he walked through the hallways, he could feel the eyes on him. Every time he stepped into the yard, he could hear the murmurs behind his back. It wasn't just the inmates. The guards, too, had turned on him. They had once been his allies, people he could count on. But now they treated him like a pariah. They watched him with suspicion, with disdain. No longer was he a fellow officer. He was a criminal, just like the men he had once locked away. The same power he had once wielded was now directed at him. They were not gentle with him. They didn't offer the same leniency they had given the other prisoners. He was left to fend for himself, a man surrounded by enemies on all sides. The isolation, the constant threats, the coldness from everyone around him. Tom could feel his mind unraveling. The walls were closing in, suffocating him. His pride, which had once been a pillar of his existence, was now a broken, crumbled thing. He had no friends left. The people he had trusted, the allies he had once counted on, were all gone. They had turned their backs on him the moment the truth came to light. In a moment of sheer desperation, Tom began to entertain the idea of escape. The thought gnawed at him, the only thing that seemed to offer him a shred of hope. He knew the prison's layout better than anyone, having spent countless hours studying it during his early days as a cop. He knew the guards' routines, the weak spots in the perimeter, the blind spots in the cameras. The thought of freedom was intoxicating. If he could just escape, just get away from this place, he could disappear. He could start over. But escape wasn't easy. It would require careful planning, precision, and the courage to face the unknown. Tom had spent days watching, learning the patterns of the guards, mapping out the routes he would need to take. He gathered whatever supplies he could find. A few scraps of metal, a small knife he had hidden, and a few pieces of wire he had managed to steal. He was ready. The night he decided to make his move, the air in his cell felt thick, like the world was holding its breath. His heart pounded in his chest as he waited for the perfect moment, his fingers trembling with anticipation. He could feel the walls closing in on him. This was his only chance. But as Tom moved silently through the darkened corridors, his mind racing with the thrill of freedom, he was hit with the brutal reality that even in the darkest corners of his life, Maria King's influence reached him. He didn't see her, couldn't hear her, but her presence was everywhere. She was the shadow in the corner of his mind, the reminder of his fall, the specter of justice that loomed over every move he made. When Tom reached the outer perimeter, ready to scale the fence and disappear into the night, a voice echoed in the stillness, cold and clear, stopping him dead in his tracks. "Going somewhere, Officer Reed?" Tom froze, his blood turning to ice. He hadn't seen anyone, hadn't heard a single footstep. The voice was too calm, too familiar. He turned slowly, his heart racing, and there she was, Maria King. She wasn't physically standing in front of him, but her influence was unmistakable. Her reach had extended into every corner of his life. Even here, in this hellhole that I am a blur, he realized what had happened. His every move had been monitored, his every action anticipated. Maria had known. She had known he would try to escape, and she had set it up, made sure it would fail. No matter where he went, no matter how far he ran, she would be there, watching, waiting for him to make his move. The guards, the very ones who had abandoned him, now stood in the shadows, their eyes cold and unfeeling. They had known all along. The escape had been a trap, a test to see how far he would go. And in his desperation, Tom had walked right into it. With a surge of anger, Tom tried to run, but it was too late. The guards were already on him, dragging him back to his cell. His heart sank as he realized that Maria had won. She had orchestrated it all, pulling the strings from behind the scenes, even when he thought he had escaped her reach. The last thing Tom saw before they slammed the door shut was the cold, unblinking eyes of the man who had once been his ally, now just another figure in Maria's game. And deep down, Tom knew that he would never escape the justice she had brought down on him. His fate was sealed, and there was no running, no hiding from it. The days in prison felt like endless echoes, each hour dragging Tom Reed deeper into the abyss. His attempts to hold on to any semblance of control had long since crumbled. Maria's influence over the legal system, the prison, and every corner of his life had ensured that he would never escape the consequences of his actions. It wasn't just the walls of the prison that held him now. He was trapped in his own mind, drowning in a flood of regret, humiliation, and fear. First, he had told himself it would pass, that with time, his former allies would come to his aid. He had always been able to talk his way out of tight spots before, didn't he? But one by one, they had turned their backs on him. The officers he had once trusted, the people who had once looked up to him as a mentor, now avoided his gaze. Even the guards, who once gave him some measure of respect, now treated him with nothing but cold indifference, or worse, disdain. No one was willing to help him, not even the ones who owed him favors. His name had become a curse, a stain that no one wanted to be associated with. And then, the whispers started. It wasn't just the other inmates who knew who he was. The whispers had spread beyond the prison walls, to the very people who had once protected him. The ones who had helped cover up his wrongdoings. One by one, they had distanced themselves, realizing that the weight of Tom's past was too great to bear. And no one, not even those who had helped him bury the truth, was willing to risk their own careers to save him. Maria had orchestrated it all, patiently, methodically, and with precision. Every move she made, every decision she made had been calculated. She had been playing the long game, waiting for this moment when Tom would finally crumble under the weight of his own arrogance. The truth she had carefully and relentlessly exposed had become his undoing. She wasn't just dismantling his career. She was dismantling his entire existence, piece by piece, and he could do nothing to stop it. Tom had thought he was invincible, that his badge gave him the power to do anything, to destroy anyone who got in his way. But now, as he sat in the dimly lit cell, he understood just how wrong he had been. His arrogance had been his greatest weakness. His belief that he was untouchable had led to his total destruction. Maria had been right all along. He had underestimated her. He had thought she was just another person to control, another obstacle to crush under his heel. But she had outplayed him at every turn, and now his life was a shattered wreck. The sound of heavy boots approaching his cell snapped Tom from his thoughts. He had learned to dread the footsteps. He knew what was coming next. The guards opened the door, their faces unreadable, and motioned for him to step out. It was time. He could feel the final blow coming, the last shred of dignity he had left being ripped away from him. They led him through the cold, concrete hallways, the air thick with the stench of sweat and fear. Every step echoed, each one a reminder that there was no escape, no way to outrun the justice that Maria had set into motion. As they reached the administrative offices, Tom's eyes met the cold gaze of the warden. There was no sympathy in the warden's eyes, just a stern, unwavering look that made Tom feel smaller than ever. "You're being transferred," the warden said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Maria's orders. You've been flagged for a higher security level." Tom swallowed hard, his throat dry. He had expected something like this. He had expected the walls to close in on him completely. But it didn't make it any easier to accept as they pushed him into a holding cell. Tom felt the weight of his actions pressing down on him. There was no more fighting, no more lying his way out. Maria had ensured that the truth would follow him wherever he went, that there would be no corner left for him to hide. And the truth was this: he had ruined countless lives. He had used his badge as a weapon, not a shield. And now, it was his turn to face the consequences. The sound of doors slamming shut behind him was deafening. It wasn't just the prison door. It was the door to the life he had known. Maria had locked him in. His past was now a chain around his neck, and there was no one left to save him. The final blow had been struck, and Tom Reed was finally facing the consequences of his actions. But even as he stood there, broken, humiliated, and defeated, a part of him, the part that had once believed he was untouchable, whispered a quiet thought. Could I have stopped this? Could I have changed? It was a fleeting thought, drowned by the weight of his guilt, but it lingered, haunting him in the cold, lonely silence of his cell. Maria had won. Her justice had been absolute. And Tom, for the first time in his life, realized that nothing at all, could protect him from the truth. The days turned into months, and Tom Reed's name slowly faded from the headlines. Once, he had been a man of power, feared and respected by his colleagues, his badge a symbol of authority. But now, he was nothing more than a shadow of his former self, reduced to a mere shell of the man he had once been. The world had moved on, leaving him behind, forgotten by those who once knew his name, and disregarded by those who might have once looked up to him. In the cold isolation of his prison cell, Tom had plenty of time to reflect on what had led him to this point. He had once been a man who believed that his badge gave him the right to do anything, to control anyone, to act with impunity. His pride had been his armor, his sense of superiority his shield. But now that pride was shattered, that shield was gone. And what had been left? Nothing. Not even the respect of his peers, not even the comfort of knowing that he had once held power. All that remained was the bitter, crushing weight of his actions. Maria King's triumph was absolute. She had brought him down, not just through her position as chief of police, but through her unwavering commitment to justice, her dedication to exposing the truth no matter the cost. She had shown him and the world that no one is above the law. She had patiently waited for the moment when his own arrogance would undo him, and when it came, she had been ready to strike. She had fought not just for her own justice, but for the countless victims whose lives had been destroyed by men like Tom. Maria's pursuit of justice had been relentless, and it had changed everything. Her ability to see past the layers of corruption, her refusal to accept anything less than accountability, had exposed the truth in the harshest possible light. Through her, we saw the importance of standing up for what is right, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's difficult. Her victory wasn't just a personal one. It was a victory for every person who had ever been hurt by someone in power, for every individual who had ever been silenced by the system. The lessons from Maria's actions are clear. No one, no matter how powerful or how seemingly untouchable, can escape the consequences of their actions forever. Prejudice, arrogance, and corruption may seem to offer protection for a time, but they are ultimately hollow. In the end, they lead to nothing but destruction. Maria's victory represents more than just the downfall of one man. It represents the triumph of truth, justice, and the belief that the law is meant to protect everyone, not just those who can bend it to their will. As for Tom, his story serves as a cautionary tale, a reminder that unchecked power can be a dangerous thing. His downfall wasn't just about the slap that started it all, but about the years of choices he made, the lives he destroyed in the name of his own superiority. It's a reminder that the pursuit of power without responsibility, the disregard for human dignity, and the belief that one is above others can only lead to ruin. But there is also hope in Maria's story. It shows that no matter how deeply entrenched the system may seem, no matter how impossible the fight might appear, justice will find its way through. Maria was a woman who could have been easily dismissed, easily overlooked. But instead, she used her strength, her intelligence, and her integrity to bring about change. And in doing so, she proved that anyone, no matter their background or circumstances, can make a difference. As we reflect on this story, we can all learn something. Maria's pursuit of justice shows us that the fight for what is right may not always be easy, but it is always worth it. It shows us that the consequences of our actions, whether good or bad, are far-reaching, and that we all have a responsibility to act with integrity and fairness. Maria's success is a testament to the power of perseverance and the importance of standing firm in the face of adversity. If you've been inspired by this story, if you believe in the power of justice, truth, and accountability, then don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Stay tuned for more stories that remind us all of the importance of doing what's right. Thank you for being part of this journey, and may we all continue to strive for a world where justice prevails and no one is above the law. Subscribe now and join us for more educational, gripping, and impactful content.